eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on.
This is Lee Greenwood.
I have seen him in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. They have builded his
An altar in using that.
read his righteous sentence by the dim and fair eclipse. His day is marching on.
Come on, balcony people. There are many verses. Only one more.
The serpent with his heel.
And God is marching on.
He has sounded forth the trumpet that shall never come.
Retreat.
Sifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat. Oh, be swift, my soul, to enter him. Be jubilant,
My feet. Our God is marching on. One last time. His truth is marching on. Okay. If only it was all about glory. When the Scottish clans used to go to war, legend has it, a battle, a war, somebody was always supposed to shout, "Spare the poets! Spare the poets!" Because they had to live to tell the story. Now, that could be just a legend, but Whitman and Melville never fought in a battle, but thank God they were spared. In 1861, Whitman wrote this poem. It's just full of war fever, which the country was. Beat, beat, drums, blow, bugles blow, through the windows, through the doors, burst like a ruthless force into the solemn church and scatter the congregation into the school where the scholar is studying. Leave not the bridegroom quiet, no happiness must he have now with his bride, nor the peaceful farmer any peace, plowing his field or gathering his grain. So fierce you whir and pound, you drums. So shrill you bugles blow. A bit later on, 2 and 3 years later on, Whitman, of course, famously would work almost 3 full years in hospitals around Washington, D.C. That's an older Whitman. That earlier Whitman was the photograph or the image he used in his first edition of Leaves of Grass. How could you resist that guy in his tilted cap? But Whitman, in the midst of the war, after spending months and days in these hospitals and in and around Washington, D.C., and nursing dying and wounded soldiers, he wrote one of the greatest war poems ever, called Wound Dresser. It's a long poem, but I'll just give you one little tiny piece. Bearing the bandages, water and sponge, straight and swift to my wounded I go, where they lie on the ground after the battle brought in, where their priceless blood reddens the grass, the ground, or to the rows of the hospital tent, or under the roof's hospital, to the long rows of cots up and down each side I return. To each and all, one after another, I draw near, not one do I miss. An attendant follows holding a tray. He carries a refuse pail, soon to be filled with clotted rags, blood emptied and filled again. On I go, open doors of time, open hospital doors, the crushed head I dress, poor crazed band, poor crazed hand, tear not that bandage away. The neck of the cavalryman with the bullet through and through I examine. Hard the breathing rattles, quite glazed already the eyes. Yet life struggles hard. Come, sweet death, be persuaded, O beautiful death. In mercy, come quickly. Whitman often wrote letters home to these kids or men's parents, mothers, and so on. I came equipped with one of those, but I'll spare for the moment because just a little piece of Melville. Herman Melville never worked as a hospital nurse, but he did go visit some battlefields in Virginia after the fact. And he in particular left us visions of meanings of soldiers. The deepest meanings of the American Civil War start, there are many of them, but they start with all those common soldiers, probably 750,000 of them, who died in this war. This rings home to places like this. Melville called this poem on the slain collegians, which is my recommendation for the new poem to replace the old one over in the Yale War Memorial, but hasn't happened yet. Youth is the time when hearts are large and stirring wars appeal to the spirit, which appeals in turn to the blade it draws. If woman in sight and duty show, though made the mask of Cain, or whether it be truth's sacred cause, who can aloof remain? That shares youth's ardor, uncooled by the snow of wisdom and sordid gain. The anguish of maternal hearts must search for balm divine, but well the striplings bore their fated parts, the heavens all parts have assigned. Never felt life's care or cloy, each bloomed and died an unabated boy, nor dreamed what death was, thought it mere sliding into some vernal sphere. They knew the joy, but leaped the grief. Like plants that flower ere comes the leaf, which storms lay low in kindly doom and kill them in the flush of their bloom. Death, the death of the young, that's what war is really about. Spare the poets. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote into his diary in 1861, quote, "War is a realist. It shatters everything flimsy and shifty. It sets aside all false issues and breaks through all that is not real in itself. That's a realistic statement about the realism of war. War is a realist. It should never be treated with sentimentalism or romance. The American Civil War is the greatest rupture in American history. It's hard to get to the meaning and understanding of the cornfield at Antietam, the carnage up on Cemetery Ridge on July 3, 1863 at Gettysburg, the bodies piled on top of each other, 6 and 7 deep in the trenches of Spotsylvania Courthouse, where some of them were still alive, screaming. All this witnessed by soldiers who wrote it down. A harvest of slaughter is an ultimate meaning of this war. And I suppose the ultimate moral is avoid civil wars. Always a good idea. They don't usually go well. Death became a preoccupation in a culture accustomed to death, with all kinds of rituals and conventions about death, but never on this scale. And it took generations to even begin to recover from that, if we ever truly have. And our recovery from it has so often, to many people, necessitated a certain romance, a certain reconciliation, a certain sentimentalism in order to even begin to face it. That's one of my favorite. There are so many photographs of the Civil War because it's the first war fought on any big scale at the dawn of photography. And some of those photographers captured what we might consider some quite modern moments. Here, a bunch of soldiers, clearly in a winter setting. I don't know the date. They're boiling coffee and they're trying to keep their hands warm. They're trying to survive. In the midst of secession, Americans kept explaining to each other why this had happened, why the North stood up. Well, Lincoln's administration stood up to it. Lincoln said secession is not possible. It's unconstitutional. You cannot do it. You cannot leave that union to which you promised allegiance. He didn't employ the word treason yet. Others will later. You can't break it. Southerners, of course, said, oh, yes, we can. It's a compact. We agreed to it originally. We can agree now to get out. No. Lincoln and at least his own immediate circle said, you can't. Now, over time, there will be a Lincoln-hating industry in the American South, and I do mean industry, that will blame Lincoln and his people forever and a day. They should just let the South go. There could have been peace. This all could have been negotiated. Could have been solved. You know, there were compromise measures in that spring of 1861. One was to have a plural presidency. 3 people. One from the South, one from the North, and one from the West. Some people thought that was pretty beguiling. Others said, well, let's just resurrect the Missouri Compromise line. That worked for 30 years or so. Let's just draw that line again. Well, and then there's the Dred Scott case that declared it unconstitutional. Oh, dear. Others kept saying, well, there's always popular sovereignty. That seemed to work for a while. Where's Stephen Douglas? Well, he's going to die right after the election. After Stephen A. Douglas from Illinois, who had just lost the presidency to Abraham Lincoln, went on the road across the South begging Southerners not to secede, painting dark and terrible images of what this would lead to. But he was practically on his deathbed. He didn't live to be very old. What did Americans say they were fighting for at the outset of the war? I'm going to rush through parts of my outline today to get to especially the meanings of emancipation, the biggest turning points in this war. On the northern side, you read their rhetoric, you read their newspaper editorials and so on, and you wonder, man, they're talking about abstractions, it seems. They said they were fighting for the flag, for the Union, for the Constitution, to save the Republic. They were fighting to have a government, they said. Okay. If that was in a seminar somewhere, some professor type would say, could you define your terms? There's an almost unbelievable outpouring of patriotism after the firing on Fort Sumter. It's reflected in Whitman's beat, beat drums. Let's have it. Let's go. Enough. We've been through this for years. Let's have a fight. Sometimes people said because they had fired on the flag, and that can sound really weird to us in the 21st century, but that wasn't weird to people then. They fired 100 cannon on the U.S. flag. Something's got to be done about that. A lot of other Northerners said this was about holding together the constitutional system because it was their protector, they said. It was their shield. It was the way Americans would hold together some kind of social order. And secession meant Lincoln's own word. When he denounced it, he said, it's anarchy. The Union as a shield to Northerners, a protector. Not going to be seen that way in the South, to say the least. A New Hampshire farmer who became a buck private in 1861 said, quote, the question now is country or no country, liberty or slavery. Depending on where you were and your feelings, you might just follow that guy. You might even elect him colonel of a regiment. A 50-year-old railroad contractor who had a very good job and a very good income where was he from? New Hampshire, said he was enlisting at age 50 to, quote, help us put down this wicked and unjustifiable rebellion. Our country and property is worth nothing if we don't, nor will life ever be secure. People say very high-minded things at the beginning of war, rarely in the middle of it. Everybody's going to say they're fighting for liberty, 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 on both sides. And Abraham Lincoln is going to leave one of the classic Civil War era quotations about that, which I love. Lincoln was is 3 years ahead, but Lincoln was invited. He rarely left Washington, D.C. during the war, only 2 or 3 times. But he was invited to what was called a sanitary fair, which was an organization raising money and material for the troops in support of their families. And he went up to Baltimore to attend a sanitary fair. And the speech he gave there, this was early 1864, a dark time in the war. He said, we all, quote, declare for liberty. But in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing. To the North, freedom means each man, said Lincoln, is to enjoy the product of his labor. To the Southern man, it conveyed, he said, mastership, the power to do, quote, as they please with other men and with the product of other men's labor. No one ever had to stop Abraham Lincoln and say, would you please be clear, sir? Well, they did when he was telling dirty stories, which he was very good at. But this kind of logic was pretty clear. Liberty. Whose liberty? Liberty for what? And we still hear that word liberty. We hear that word liberty in television commercials. We hear it off the lips of politicians. We hear it all the time. We read it in Supreme Court decisions. What do we mean by liberty? Well, Southerners are going to say a lot of things about why they're going to war and what they're fighting for over and over and over. They're going to say that Union is now not their protector, it's their threat. That Union is their curse. Their future is not in it. At least the secessionists are going to argue that. They faced terrible choices. They did. In the winter and spring of 1861, to secede from the Union was very serious business. And no one knew where this was going. There was always this hope among the fire-eating secessionists, the Yankees won't fight. Lincoln and his administration, they may be abolitionists, and they're pretty righteous, and they got all those New Englanders behind them, but they're not warriors like we are. Southerners had a long list of grievances. You need the development of a social spirit behind a war effort of any kind. You need grievance, especially if you're on the defensive. And they had a lot of grievances. Their grievances were first and foremost against the fanaticism of Yankee abolitionists. They had grievances against all that effort now to stop the westward expansion of slavery. They had grievances against the idea that even Stephen Douglas had said, you can still vote slavery out in the Western Territory if that's what the people want. No, said the secessionists. Not possible. They had the same grievance in reverse that the Northern Republicans had. They believed the Dred Scott decision was now being violated by Republicans. You think we fought over the Dobbs decision? They said what they were facing was Northern tyranny, just like the American colonies in 1776 were facing British tyranny. They quickly linked themselves to the American Revolution. They were the true vessel, they said, of American liberty and independence. And they said, we are the new spirit of 76. You can get the American Revolution on your side in the 19th century. It's useful. Very useful. But then, of course, you've read Charles Dew's book, The Students, and you know that they're also arguing here that they're breaking from the Union to defend their system, their labor, their civilization, slavery, their racial order. Over and over and over, they say that to themselves in secession conventions, in letters, in newspaper editorials, over and over and over. The great Mary Chestnut, and I say great because she kept one hell of a diary, although she revised it later into pretty much a novel, although a lot of diaries are sort of novels. But Mary Chestnut in March 1861, this is right after Lincoln has been inaugurated president, the South Carolina diarist, she's married to a famous politician, she said, quote, "We separated because of incompatibility of temper. We are divorced, North from South, because we hate each other." No lack of clarity there either. We hate you. Thank you, Mary. A lot of marriage metaphors being thrown around. Even Lincoln used it in his first inaugural address. He even talked about intercourse between North and South, and said, the Union cannot divorce. Well, yes, they did. A Mississippi lawyer, last example, Walter Nugent, who did not own any slaves, nevertheless declared in 1861 that without slave labor, his country, he said, would be, quote, a barren, waste, and desolate plain. We can only live and exist by this species of labor, and hence I am willing to continue the fight to the last. And a lot of them spoke about honor. Honor. They did not want to be subjugated, which became one of their favorite words in explaining what they were doing. Subjugation was the worst thing you could encounter. You might lose a leg, you might lose an arm, you might lose a son, but you'd save your honor. Nothing lost but honor, as Henry IV said in Shakespeare. Or was that Henry III? Help me out here. Oh, come on. They were going to war, they said, in defense of home. Home. What could be more important? A Confederate officer, right after the Battle of Bull Run, the first Bull Run, in June of 61, Charles Jones Jr., the famous Jones family of Georgia, they left more letters than any family in the United States. Unbelievable stashes of letters. And Charles Jones Jr. was already officer in the Confederate Army, wrote home and he said, "No more sacred obligation can rest upon my people." This is after they had won a battle. "Than those now devolved upon us to protect our homes, our loves, our lives, our property, our religion, and our liberties from the inhuman and infidel hordes who threaten us with invasion, dishonor, and subjugation." He's writing that to his sister. I guess he's showing off for his sister. Nothing lost but honor. Liberty, liberty, liberty. The North has many advantages. Physical, material advantages in this war at the outset. You can see a little bit of that here in this huge Union encampment down in that valley. I love this photo. What a clever photographer who took this one. He must have told those guys, "Now just sit still and look ahead." They had an advantage. Well, actually, the South had an advantage if they had chosen really to use it. If you just look at this map, the South had the advantage in this war, at least early, of what the military historians call the advantage of interior lines. That is, they could move people and material shorter distances. Just make a large circle of a Union front line that may go all the way from northern Virginia all the way out down along the Mississippi to the Gulf. But inside of that, the Confederate line, so to speak, would be much shorter. And hence, they can move things within their half circle that the Union side can't without going way around their circle. Of course, the Union will engage in a blockade. The first large such blockade in maritime history. They've been attempted before, but never on this scale. The Union blockade of the Confederate coastlines at first was a sieve. 80 and 90% of everything got through in 1861 and most of 62. By 63, they had it down to like 50 and 60% shutting down shipping. And the South was always trying to get aid from Britain in particular, also France. By 1864, the blockade was not airtight, but getting close to it. Because the North had a navy. South is beginning to have a navy built for them by the British, and that will be a post-war problem. The North had a massive advantage in this war in terms of industry and manufacturing. I could go on the whole rest of the lecture about this, and it tells a tale. It had 4 times the deposits in finances and bank deposits. There were 110 manufacturing establishments across the North. That was 4 times what the South could even imagine having. One Connecticut county, New Haven, produced firearms valued at 10 times what the whole of the American South could produce by 62 and 63. I've often said the Civil War was won right up here on Winchester Street. partly. It had 97% of all firearms in America were in the northern states. It had 94% of all the production of cloth. It had 93% of all production of pig iron. And I could go on and on and on. The shoe industry, boots, 90-some%. How could the South even imagine? How could the Confederacy even imagine they're going to make war on this industrial Goliath? It's exactly what William Tecumseh Sherman said to a fellow officer when they were stationed in New Orleans at the time of secession. Sherman leaned to his Southern-born good friend and he said, in effect, buddy, no nation of farmers ever made war on the nation of industrialists and lived to tell it. Mostly true. The North had 90% of all railroad miles. Now, if Jefferson Davis could have sat down in front of his cabinet and read all that stuff to his cabinet, oh dear, who knows what they would have done. They didn't quite have all that data in front of them. One other quick thing, though. This is where the politics comes in. The North had an existing political party system. The Democratic Party's not gone. It's not dead. Republicans are in power now, but only loosely. Their power is going to increase for a little while, but they're going to lose congressional seats when the war gets ugly and morale dips. But they had an existing political party system, which means a president like Lincoln can use the whip, so to speak, political whip, on his party. Democrats are a legitimate opposition. There has to be appeals to the electorate. They're going to have elections during wartime, during a civil war. The South has only one party. It's called the Confederacy. It did not have a party system. It was invented in part to get rid of a party system. Its party was the slaveholding South. That's really going to hurt them eventually. Oh, there are lots of other military advantages and disadvantages of various kinds on both sides. Both sides had that hideous thing called the rifled musket. I don't know where I put my... Oh, well, there's a clicker here somewhere. Say what? Oh, thank you. Thank you. Good eyes, Wolf. The North's also going to have Abraham Lincoln. I'm not a Lincoln was a saint. Lincoln was the greatest this and the greatest that kind of historian, although Lincoln was remarkable. Oh, you're supposed to laugh at a poster like this, but it's fine. It's okay. I'm not offended. It means most of you probably didn't see Spielberg's film called Lincoln. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. Lincoln steps out of the poster and kicks the hell out of the secessionists, of course. But it also had the Union armies, which at first didn't always win, but eventually, with Ulysses Grant in the West, William T. Sherman in the Deep South, to some degree, the dead of the Army of the Potomac in Virginia over 2 ghastly years of bad leadership nonetheless. This map simply shows you, if you can't probably read the dates here, but the purple line at the top is where things started with Union occupation in 1861. The next green region, or blue, excuse me, is 1862. The green region is 1863. It's not as clean as this map makes it, but you can begin to see that invasions of the South, first in Kentucky, then in Tennessee, and then down along the Mississippi River. New Orleans fell to the Union forces as early as April 1862, the mouth of the Mississippi, the greatest trade corridor in the country. And eventually, with the fall of Vicksburg on the Mississippi, a huge turning point, July 1863, Union gunboats and Union forces controlled the whole Mississippi, and as Lincoln put it, The father of waters flows unvexed to the sea. Lincoln was a poet, too. But that divided the Confederacy. Parts of its aid and support were actually getting to them through Mexico from the French, who were always looking for a way to divide America. Not anymore. And you look at the orange parts of this, it's 1864. It includes even Sherman's March to the Sea. It includes the horrific Overland Campaign, or the Virginia Campaign of 1864 up in Virginia, Grant's campaign against Lee, the worst fighting of the war, 60,000 Union casualties in 3 months. And then finally, the red parts, that's Sherman's army marching northward through South Carolina into North Carolina and forcing a Confederate surrender just outside Raleigh, North Carolina in 65. And then you can see a red part from Richmond west toward Lynchburg, which is the final movements of Lee's army to the surrender at Appomattox. Now, meanings. As I said, if you want a big meaning, you have to answer, how indeed? Oops, sorry. How indeed did the war for limited aims, and at the outset of the war, that's exactly what it was. How did a war for limited aims? Because in both cases, strategically, rhetorically, the Confederacy told the world all they were fighting for was their independence, to be left alone, to go their own way, to establish a Confederate States of America. They didn't call themselves the Slaveholders' Republic. We do, most historians do today, because they were. And the fact that it's a slaveholding republic is going to have everything to do with why, when, and how Great Britain will enter this war or not enter this war, which was crucial if it had happened. On the northern side, at the outset, all Lincoln's administration and officers kept saying was, this is just a war to restore the Union. It is not to be, as Lincoln said in 62, a remorseless revolutionary struggle. He wanted most to avoid a remorseless revolutionary struggle, because nobody knows the outcome of such things. We can all look back now and say, Lincoln was timid. Cautious is another word, maybe a better word. He was also a gradualist. That's not Lincoln, that's Grant. I'll come back to Grant in a minute. There he is. And I'll come back to those black soldiers in a minute. Now, Abraham Lincoln, if he'd had his way, and he said it over and over, would have prosecuted this war as quickly as possible to its least revolutionary result, if possible. And if slavery was to be destroyed by this war, and that was always there, he wanted it to be gradual, and he wanted it to end with colonization, that is, removal of some African Americans from American society. Make no mistake, Lincoln was a colonizationist until he was not. There's a clause for colonization even in the first or the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation of September 22, 1862. He's very vaguely saying that if the people being freed from slavery here, they will be, or they will set up a plan and a system, and there would be money allocated to remove them elsewhere. It's not clear where. It's led to a forever debate over whether Lincoln really meant that, or it was, a red herring, balloon. he did mean it, I think, until he didn't. Now, it is the war itself, the scale of the war, enveloping the southern landscape, enveloping northern villages and towns with lists of the dead, enveloping northern industries, which are now being, in effect, all but taken over by the federal government in an amazing overnight collaboration, mobilization by the Quartermaster Corps, a whole new, brand new agency of the federal government created literally overnight in historical time to engage in contracts between the federal government and all kinds of businesses to make the stuff of war. And by early 1864, that Quartermaster Corps, this is mobilization. No one ever imagined doing this. That Quartermaster Corps was the second largest employer in the United States, second only to the Union Army. That's what total war is. It's when society gets mobilized. Sometimes we only define total war by the weapons being used. Okay, fine. That's part of it. But it's the mobilization of societies to destroy the other society. And the longer this war goes on, the more it will become that. That's perhaps an inevitability that I would argue for. But Lincoln's always been a bit of a conundrum in this, hasn't he? Americans love to have their Lincoln pure. He was either the great emancipator or he was not. He was either the author of the greatest liberatory document ever, or no, he was just this wily old cat tricking everybody, as Malcolm X once said. Malcolm X famously said, no one ever tricked the United States as much as Abraham Lincoln. Yeah. Malcolm hadn't read enough yet, at least not of that subject. The greatest fact, in some ways, you can know about Abraham Lincoln is not only that he had a lot of the conventional racism of his generation, and he did. He was very fond of racist stories and even racist songs. But he had the capacity to grow politically. And it's hard to always judge this, but even grow morally. If the war had been over in the first year or the second year of this war, emancipation would have been a very different process. It would have been very, very limited. We wouldn't be talking about it either as much or nearly the same way. But the fact that this war kept going on into 1863 and 4 and 5, it had to become a war on Southern society, and a war on Southern society had to be a war on the whole Southern social and labor system. It's always led to the two sides of Lincoln, the ambiguity. Was he or wasn't he? There's so many people who've weighed in on this one. How about H.L. Mencken, the great satirist of the 1920s and 30s? Abraham Lincoln becomes, he said, the American solar myth, the chief butt of American credulity and sentimentality, rendered a mere apparition, a sort of amalgam of John Wesley and the Holy Ghost, fit for adoration at the Chautauquas and a YMCA. Make your Lincoln whatever you want to make him. He'll show up. Probably. Sandburg, Carl Sandburg, the great poet, lyrical historian, called Lincoln the greatest and beautiful paradox in American history. But my favorite description of Lincoln comes from none other than W.B. Du Bois, the great black scholar, who had the amazing grace to say this about Lincoln. He said this in an essay he wrote in 1922. He'd gotten sick and tired of all this admiration of Robert E. Lee and the Confederate lost cause. And finally, at one point, Du Bois said, hey, what's happened to Lincoln? And Du Bois said, I love him. Not because he was perfect, but because he was not. And yet he triumphed. He was big enough to be inconsistent, cruel, merciful, peace-loving, a fighter, despising Negroes, and then letting them fight and vote, protecting slavery and freeing slaves. He was a man, a big, inconsistent, brave man. Now, I'm going to save a little bit of the meaning of emancipation for next time when we end the war and talk about all the, frankly, incredible challenges that this war left, which we call Reconstruction, which actually begins during the war, to say the least. The most revolutionary aspect of the Civil War is, of course, well, not of course, there are many revolutionary aspects of the Civil War, but certainly one of them is eventually the enlistment of these guys. I love this photo because it's such a close-up of these proud black soldiers. And the guy on the right sustained a smile for that photographer. It's as though they're saying, I got my Union blue on. I got a sash around my belt. I got a musket on my shoulder, and I got the letters U.S. on my belt. Don't mess with me. Now, about 180,000 black men will serve in the Union Army, 80% of them from the southern states. We forget that. They're not all from Massachusetts and New York and came together in the 54th Massachusetts to march down Beacon Street in 1863 and then be in the movie Glory. But by 1863, Lincoln has issued the final Emancipation Proclamation, and in the last little paragraph, read it, folks, it's very short. It doesn't even fill a page and a half. It says, from this day forward, all slaves in the states in rebellion against the United States will be thenceforward and forever free. Now, a lot of people always look back at that and say, oh, he's only freeing the slaves and the states in rebellion. He's not freeing everybody. He legally couldn't. At least that's what he believed. But every forward step of Union forces, Army, Navy, and otherwise, for the rest of the war was a forward step to liberate people. That was not always pretty. Believe me, and I'll talk a little more about the lack of prettiness at the end next Tuesday, at the end of the war and aftermath. But here's what happened in 1864. By 64, the country faces yet another potentially endless year of war. The war is not only not over, it's not even close to over. And that winter, the country's going to have to decide, are they going to hold a presidential election in the midst of a civil war? A general election in the midst of a civil war? And this, I would argue, is one of the two or three greatest turning points in the war. It's equal in many ways to Antietam, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg. It's the re-election of Lincoln, which was by no means a foregone conclusion. In fact, it was the opposite. That winter of 64, the Democratic Party began to oppose Lincoln as any political party would. They began to stamp the Republicans with the label of emancipation. Emancipation. They're the party of black freedom. They're the party endangering your daughters. They're the party endangering the future of the United States with black freedom. They called Lincoln Abraham Africanus I, implying that he was black. Who knows? They even invented the word miscegenation. It came into American parlance that year, meaning mixing the races. Republicans will force intermarriage. The Republicans kept trying to just sort of, bat this away. They couldn't bat it away. There was a movement within the Republican Party to dump Lincoln. War weariness was terrible across the North. The casualties horrific. And they're about to get much worse in the summer of 64. And Lincoln thought he was at great risk of losing the fall election to George McClellan, the former commander of the Army of the Potomac, and the Democrats' candidate for president, who was pretty much decidedly pro-slavery, even if he was pro-union. But the Democrats were offering the South a deal. It wasn't clear what the deal was going to be, but they were going to do a negotiated peace. A negotiated peace. And Republicans are saying, no. Lincoln called Frederick Douglass to the White House in August of 64. It's the second time that they had met. The first time it was at Douglas's insistence. That didn't go very well. This time, Lincoln invites the most important black spokesman in the country to the White House, sits him down and says, what do you think I should do? Do you think I should back away from emancipation right now because the electorate seems to be against us? And Douglas said, no. And Lincoln didn't, and it's not clear he meant that he would. Lincoln was always throwing up balloons in front of people to see if they popped them. Lincoln was saved by the fall of Atlanta and the fall of Mobile, Alabama to Admiral Farragut in the largest naval engagement of the war. Both. One happened in late August of 64, the other in the first week of September. The fall of Atlanta, headlines everywhere in the country. Seemed like now it's possible, just possible, the Union forces are going to go all the way across Georgia to the sea. Douglas wanted to campaign for Lincoln. They wouldn't let him. They didn't want that black man out there campaigning for them. They already got stamped emancipation all over them. So what does Douglas do? I'll make it quick. They wouldn't let him go campaign, so he went to the black church in Rochester, New York, the Spring Street AME, and he gave this rousing speech the Sunday after the election. And he opened the speech with the story of Noah's Ark. You may have been wondering why Noah's Ark was on my outline. He didn't even tell them his text. They knew it was from Genesis. That's in the Bible. And Douglas said, at some point, the ark, the ship seemed to hit ground. And Noah wondered, is it possible? Is the flood over? Is it possible? And Noah sent a dove out of the ark, and the dove came back with a green olive branch in its beak. And so Noah sent the dove out again, and the dove did not return. And Noah decided, could be over. So he took the tarp off the ark, and lo, the world was turning green. At the end of that speech, Douglas said to his black audience, he said, next Sunday, I'm going to Baltimore. Because the place he had escaped from back in 1838, and he'd never been back to, except on a train one time. He said, I'm going back to Baltimore, to the free state of Baltimore, because the state of Maryland had just had a referendum deciding whether to become a free state. And the vote was about 12,800 and something to 12,600 and something. It was an election like we have. Unbelievably close. But it decided to be a free state. He said, I'm going home. Home? To the free state of Maryland. And he did the next week, and he had paparazzi in tow. And that's why we know so much about it. He went to the another AME church in Fells Point that he had worshipped at as a teenager. in Baltimore. And he walked up to the front door, and there was a black woman waiting for him. And she said, "Hello, Frederick, I'm Eliza, your sister." She was his older sister. He hadn't seen her since 1836. It's not clear he recognized her. But he grabbed Eliza by the arm, he marched her up the main aisle of the church, and we're told that up on the altar were American flags all around. And Douglass got up and he started the speech same way he did in Rochester. Noah, the ark, the dove doesn't come back. Dove goes back out. And Douglass said, "Today, I am the dove. I am the rainbow on the sky. That I, former slave, am on free soil in Maryland. I am the dove." Now that takes chutzpah, to put yourself into Genesis. But he got away with it. That's how important Frederick Douglass, at least conceived at that moment, was the re-election of Lincoln and now the real possibility of prosecuting the war to an end.